up early. I made the mistake of getting up early this morning, and I read the news. Yeah. And it appears that a lot of Nazis have taken over in Washington. I've kept staring at this one here. A lot of Nazis, and they're trying to force us to have health care. Good on John McCain. John McCain called out the people who use this term, Nazis, to mean absolute evil. It's a metaphor. McCain is like, actual Nazis, people you disagree with in Washington. It dishonors the people who fought in World War II against, the actual Nazis. I've coined a term I call odd Nazism. It's related to ad nauseum. That's when you talk about Nazis till you make people sick. Hence the health care. If we didn't laugh, we would run screaming from the room, right? Humor can be healing, can be grace. My wonderful colleague, Phil Anderson, used to teach a course called Humor is Healing and Grace. Humor and anger are very closely related. But you look at this thing that is happening. And how do we understand it biblically? We've got texts like the one that was just read. Not a lot of just peacemaking in that text. There's a gulf. Get away from me. Even if somebody died, they wouldn't believe him. Post the destruction of the temple, biblical apocalyptic, you're going to go to hell, judgment. It is a biblical theme. Biblical apocalyptic is strong. Gulf, you can't get there from here. There are other biblical themes, biblical theologies. Which one or ones fit our time? Now, given the prevalence of Nazis in our contemporary rhetoric, one of the things I wrote about in the latter chapters of Occupy the Bible was Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who was the famous German theologian who was ultimately hung by the Nazis for resisting Hitler. That would be the actual Hitler. He came to believe that the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount should be just taken literally. And he came to believe that not because of what he was taught by the famous German theologians of his time, Adolf von Harnack and others. He learned that from the African American church in Harlem. Bonhoeffer came to do a postdoctoral fellowship at Union Theological Seminary. He met Frank Fisher. He's an African American student. And he introduced Bonhoeffer to the church in Harlem. This was such a challenge to what was happening in Germany the time that Bonhoeffer left. The Christian church was coming more and more under the influence of the Nazis and their consolidation of power. And it resulted in a Reichskirche, a German church to promote the state religion. And the theologies, the liberal theologies of the time, couldn't stand up to it because they understood biblical teachings like the Sermon on the Mount to be something you internalize. You had an internal relationship by reading the New Testament but you could still outwardly obey the Third Reich. A very subjective view of biblical interpretation. Bonhoeffer gets to Harlem, and he's like, wait a minute. These folks think we actually ought to try to make justice in the world. Bonhoeffer began to understand from the biblical critique of racism, the racism of anti-Semitism. He discovered the black church actually planned to live the gospel, the civil rights movement. So he returns to Germany. He becomes convinced he cannot be safe during this time. And joins a group formed in 1934 called the Confessing Church. They broke away from the German Christian churches. They formed a new church. Bonhoeffer and the others looked around at the churches of their time, and they said, are they up to it? Can they resist Hitler? And I said, no, they can't. They looked at the seminaries, and they asked themselves, are the seminaries up to it? And they said no. And they started a new seminary, Finkenwald. In 1937, Bonhoeffer published The Cost of Discipleship, committing himself to a literal teaching of the literal teachings of Jesus on discipleship, and especially the Sermon on the Mount. The Bible, says Bonhoeffer, is not an abstraction. But in claiming we need to follow the teachings of Jesus in this world, it's a costly decision, says Bonhoeffer. It's a costly decision. You can't just go along Christ, pay the price for our sins, we get a nice pass, and we can go on our merry way, wrapped in a cloak of self-righteousness. It's cheap grace. It's cheap. We got in Washington with these Nazi illusions is we got cheap evil. We're looking at every place except where the real evil is. Namely, folk hungry. No houses. Prisons that are pipelines from schools. Demonizing teachers. When did that happen? That teachers became the enemy. They look every place but where the real evil is. Cheap grace and cheap evil go together. And you get on Nazism. The Sermon on the Mount is the centerpiece of Jesus' teaching, according to Bonhoeffer. It led him to resist Hitler's Germany, and ultimately it led to his death. Now, when we in the United Church of Christ first published a Just Peace Church, I was contacted by a surviving member of the Confessing Church, Herr Pastor Broch. And they translated a Just Peace Church into German. And I traveled with Pastor Broch in Germany, talking about a Just Peace Church. They ultimately, the Evangelical Church of the Union, adopted Just Peace for their churches. We went to Buchenwald together, where many members of the Confessing Church had been tortured and killed by the Nazis. Pastor Broch was the first seminary student from Finkenwald ordained by the Confessing Church. And we went to Weimar. Buchenwald is up the hill from Weimar. It's visible from the town square. Like many Americans, or many in the world, you think, well, this is a great evil, but perhaps people didn't know. You could see it, and you could smell it. Especially, of course, when the ovens were running. and the other surviving members of the confessing church adopted the just peace paradigm because they believed what Bonhoeffer had written about the Sermon on the Mount. And they told me so. I went back to Germany for the 20th anniversary of their adopting the just peace paradigm. And we talked about what was then, of course, on fire in Germany is interfaith relations. Interfaith just peacemaking will be translated into German. You got to know what time it is to do biblical theology. You got to know who Rome is. You've got to recognize that there are biblical paradigms of judgment, of division, of naming. When Jesus encounters the man possessed by a demon, what's he do? He calls him by name. I know who you are. Jesus calls him Legion. Legion. Now, of course, it could just be, somebody's first name. But since it was the name of the Roman military organization, what do you think Jesus is saying? We know your name, Rome. We know your militarism. And we have called you out. Not only called you out, we called you out and put you into pigs. Kind of a judgment. I could be wrong, but I think it really wasn't a compliment on Jesus' part, given, the status of pork. We know you. We know who you are. But do we choose the paradigm in the text that we heard of Lazarus? Sometimes you have to say no. This far and no farther. But the paradigm of the Sermon on the Mount is a move towards it paradigm. There's a reason why we need to be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Don't get stuck in one biblical paradigm. You do your contextual analysis, you know what time it is, you know who Rome is, you know who isn't Nazis, and then you take this biblical strategy. Don't get caught. We got to be quick on our feet. Tough times. The Sermon on the Mount is my view, and Pastor Walsh is the first person who pointed this out to me. He said, the reason we like the just peace paradigm is that it in fact is the Sermon on the Mount. It is nonviolent communication. Blessed are the merciful, for they will seek mercy. You can't have nonviolent communication without empathy. You must try as hard as it is, whatever it is, to move toward the very source of what is causing the conflict. Try to understand it. Not agree with it. Understand it. At least feel the fear. At least feel the fear. Feel the anger. Feel the distress. What must it feel like as someone elected to serve the people, to be bought and paid for? How good is that for your soul? Independent initiatives. Blessed are the peacemakers. Jesus doesn't say in the Sermon on the Mount, it would be nice if we had some peace. No, he says. He said peacemakers. Peace has to be made. That's the whole just peace paradigm in a nutshell. You have to go out and make it, because it doesn't just happen. Cooperative conflict resolution. Blessed are the meek. Bad translation in my view. A better term is blessed are the gentle. Blessed are the kind. Conflict mediation is being kind enough, gentle enough to be able to bring people together. That's working in open and affirming, isn't it? What changes people? I'm homophobic. I can tell you Ken Stone, our dean and who does queer ethics and Hebrew Bible, Ken did a study why people change their mind. It's not because they read a really great queer interpretation of the Hebrew Bible. It's not the reason why people change their mind. What happens is people know somebody. You know the coworker, the family member, the son, the daughter, whomever. Dick Cheney on every other issue, right? His daughter's a lesbian. Now we got a whole sibling thing going on there, but you know, doesn't work completely in every family. But there's that connectional, relational element that creates the space. Then people can move. But they make that connection, reduces the conflict, and allows people to come toward the love of God and the love of neighbor. Forgiveness. Blessed are those who mourn. So much of the dynamic of undealt with pain is behind our failure to forgive. And you cannot forgive until you have grieved it. Either yourself, I didn't, or I did, I should have. Jim Forbes, you know, Reverend Forbes, who was Riverside for so long, he preached at Fourth Presbyterian Church, big downtown Chicago church. All the, downtowners go there. I went to hear Jim. And Jim preached the reason people don't give of themselves, do more social justice work, is because they cannot forgive themselves for what they have done or what they have failed to do. I'm not doing justice to that sermon. Jim preached this, and I swear I'm looking down the pew, and there are people there in minks leaning over the pew going, help me. Presbyterians? Presbyterians in fur? Crying. Turned inward, heads down. But where's the power of that in our churches? You are forgiven. Psst. I don't believe people in worship. People don't believe it because they have not grieved it. They have not grieved it. And my genius colleague, Dow Edgerton, invented a companion class for the forgiveness class on grief. And people go from the grief class to the forgiveness class, to the forgiveness class to the grief class, but it's all there. Blessed are those who mourn. We are not called to admire the Sermon on the Mount as some high ideals, but to actually live the Sermon on the Mount and to practice that paradigm. It does not mean that we cannot access other biblical paradigms. There is a time for denunciation, and there is a time for enunciation. I think you need to use both. I think you need to be wise in your contextual analysis. When there's a lot of conflict going on, I'm moving toward a connectional paradigm. But when we have tight, inbred relationalism, maybe mistaking race or class for unity, there can be time for a little disruption, just a little prophetic, just a little, let's just mess with that. Because it needs to be messed with. We've got to allow ourselves to be formed and reformed. People will better believe us when we take our debates into the public square, if that's the kind of community we are. If people know, they know us by our fruits. Do they know us by our fruits? Do we practice when we preach? Do we actually move toward each other when there's conflict? If we are known in that way, if we are known, then they will know.